up to the end of next year. They think by the end of the year we'll be in recession, and it will be as deep as the 1990s. Interest rates now at 1.75%. That's the biggest increase, that 0.5% increase for 27 years. That means on a £250,000 standard variable rate mortgage, over a 25-year term, you'll pay on average £74 a year, £74 more a month. That's £888 a year. So if you're on a standard variable rate mortgage, if you're on a tracker mortgage, your mortgage repayment will go up immediately, and the advice would be to move to a fixed rate as soon as possible. Now, the question is, if you're going to move to a fixed rate mortgage, as 3/4 of those who have mortgages are on, how long do you fix that for? Because how long is this going to last? Well, of course, economics is all about forecasting. It's all about crystal ball gazing. It's not precise, those predictions. So people on those tracker and standard variable rate mortgages are advised to move to a fixed rate mortgage. Also from the bank today, predictions of inflation reaching 13% by the end of the year. And lasting well into next year, driven by those really high energy prices. They reckon that by October, on average, the household energy bill will be £300 a month. That's 3 times higher than it was a year ago. And with such a deep recession, with growth in the economy contracting, it's going to have a big effect on the numbers and the proposed policies and the Conservative leadership challenge, both from Liz Truss and from Rishi Sunak. Because Liz Truss says she wants to cut taxes using £30 billion of fiscal headroom. That £30 billion, if this forecast from the Bank of England is correct, has gone. So how's she going to fund those tax cuts? How's she going to grow the economy? Is she going to borrow more? Is she going to raise taxes elsewhere? And also, what are the implications for Rishi Sunak? It certainly means that we're going to have a different kind of debate in the hustings ahead to the kind of slightly repetitive nature of the exchange of policies that we've had so far.
That's Paul Hawkins at the Bank of England. Paul, thanks very much indeed. Let's turn to Victoria Scholar, who's Head of Investment at Interactive Investor, here in the studio. Victoria, welcome to you. Thanks for coming in. I'm on the verge of a weekend, so I'm determined to be cheerful, even in the face of this cheerless story. Ambrose Evans-Pritchard of the Telegraph today seeks to remind us that interest rates are going up to combat inflation. But actually, when you look at inflation internationally, figures just released by the OECD, they have us, by their calculations, our inflation rate at 8.2, US 9.1, Spain 10.2, Sweden, Austria, Portugal 8.7, Netherlands 8.6. OK, Germany and France are below us. France has particular circumstances around them. My point is, if you switch on to the airwaves today or pick up a newspaper, you'll think we're in some sort of inflation hellhole. But look at the comparisons.
Yeah, and not just that, also if we put this interest rate move into historic context, because if we think back to the early 90s, interest rates were up above 13%, and in the 70s, Margaret Thatcher raised them to 17% at the peak, and we're just at 1.75%.
Yeah, I mean, that's context, isn't it? And of course, it's good for savers, bad for borrowers, as Paul was making clear, but better news for savers.
Better news for savers-ish, but not when we put it into the context of inflation, because inflation is nearly at 10%, savings rate are just around 1%-ish. That's negative in real terms. So you're still not getting a return on your savings in the bank. Yes, it is an improvement, but not in real terms. So nominal savings rates are going up. Real savings rates are still below zero.
Is this the only club, Victoria, the Bank of England has in its locker to clobber inflation? And if it is, and I think it is the only big one they've got, this is not where the matter rests, is it, with 1.75%? Expect more before the year's out.
Yeah, the Bank of England today has been clear that it wants to stress that this is the main tool. It does also have gilt purchases or gilt sales. So that's the opposite of quantitative easing, which is where you inject money and liquidity.
You take money out of the economy.
You take money out of the economy. That's a sort of secondary tool. But the Bank of England has been clear to reiterate that interest rates are its main tool. But the Bank of England is in a difficult conundrum because it's trying to tackle imported supply-side inflation. So inflation that's been driven by factors from overseas, the war in Ukraine.
Well, that's why I mentioned America. People are quite parochial sometimes about these things, aren't they? They don't see the wider international context.
Yeah, it's very much an international issue. You know, inflation's rising, as you said at the beginning, in many, many countries. It's not necessarily something that we're going to be able to change by changing mortgage rates and savings rates. Yes, it will go to some extent to take some of the heat out of the economy, but it's certainly not going to solve the whole problem.
Final question, and I hesitate to ask it because it's really quite technical and abstract and likely to lead even more of our viewers and listeners to switch off. But you mentioned Margaret Thatcher, and we think back to the early years of Thatcherism and monetarism even, and you mentioned sucking money out of the economy, which was the idea behind monetarism, wasn't it? That the idea that there'd be less money going around in the washing machine. Does anybody still believe in that stuff?
Well, I mean, if we think back to what we've been seeing in recent years, ever since 2008, our economy and financial markets have been underpinned by cheap money. We've had rock bottom interest rates, and we've had the injection of quantitative easing, which is flooding the economy with money. So it's very much an important force that's been driving a lot of the gains that we've seen for the FTSE 100, for example, as well as some of the strength in the economy. That's why there's been this sort of panic this year, because inflation has meant that we've had no choice but to take this punch bowl away. Financial markets have gone berserk. They don't like it at all. And many people have never really seen a time when interest rates are going up because they've been low for so long. But that is not normal. Interest rates go up as well as down. Inflation comes up, and it will go down at some point as well.
Victoria Scholar, really appreciate you coming to the studio. Thanks very much indeed. Emma Webb's alongside Victoria with some thoughts on this one. That sense that actually people have got used to things like low interest rates, and it's not the natural order of things.
Absolutely, and I think as well that one of the issues surrounding everything to do with the cost of living crisis is that the government haven't been very effective in communicating this to people. Not only are people not used to this, but I include myself in this, a lot of these things totally go over the head of most people because it's outside of the realm of most people's experiences, and also it's exceptionally technical, and it requires some real economic nous to understand exactly what's going on here and how it's going to affect you. And so you can hear things about, it being worse for people who have certain types of mortgages, and you may hear that it's good for savers. But actually, in terms of understanding the ins and outs of exactly what is going on, I think for many people that's confusing. And politicians have not been successful in communicating what is going on and how their policies relate to what is going on. And so I think that's causing a lot of anxiety in relation to the points that you've made.
OK, Victoria, just before you go, just on that point, are we sort of economically illiterate increasingly in this country, if Emma's right?
I mean, I think most people don't love reading the business pages or the economic pages, or when you think about interest rates, your eyes kind of roll. So I understand the point, and yeah, but it does really affect all of us. Many people have savings, many people have mortgages, and a lot of people want to make sure that they've got enough money for retirement, and that requires some investing, perhaps. Certainly requires some savings. So I really think that economic literacy is really, really important, but whether or not it's accessible enough is another question. OK. Victoria, thanks very much indeed.
Emails on this topic. Paul asks, when will the Bank of England governor resign? We like pithy questions. Boyle says, does the governor of the Bank of England have a crystal ball? I think the recession will be more like 3 or more years. Well, is one crystal ball any better than another? There's a thought. We're going to leave economics and politics now. Rishi Sunak has attacked Liz Truss's plans for the economy before facing each other in a live TV debate happening tonight. And Ms Truss has won a significant backer. The former Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, who was reputedly described by Rishi Sunak as his political guru. He described him as his Jedi Knight, in fact. Was it Jedi Knight?
Jedi Knight?
Jedi Knight, yeah. Just turning to Tom Harwood for clarification on that one. Yeah, Jedi Knight. Meanwhile...
They famously saw a Star Wars film together about a year ago, I think it was. And there was a photo posted on Twitter of both of them standing in front of, I think it might have been one of the new ones. Was it?
This is the blind leading the blind.
It really is. There's a very famous photograph of the two of them standing in front of a big Star Wars poster, nerding out over one of the new releases.
Point is, Tom, he's knifed him, hasn't he?
I think that...
Lightsabered him.
To some extent, this might not have been the most surprising thing in the world. Because let's not forget the pitch that Sajid Javid himself was putting forward when he was standing to be leader of the Conservative Party. I went along to his leadership launch, and he handed out to all of the assembled press there a pretty weighty document of economic reform. He wanted to cancel the national insurance rise. He wanted to cancel the corporation tax rise. He wanted to push forward a more radical economic reform agenda that is very much more in line with Liz Truss than Rishi Sunak. So potentially friendship and history and sharing the same job aside, the very fundamental of economics might have been what's to play here.
And it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I know throughout the leadership contest, it's being the legitimate heir to Margaret Thatcher has been in play as an idea, and yet wasn't it Sajid Javid who had a picture above his desk of Margaret Thatcher? I mean, that was years ago, right? So, I mean, he's a Thatcherite.
He is. When he became business secretary back in 2014, he erected an image of Margaret Thatcher in his office, and he was always seen to be one of those who was within that sort of caucus of the Conservative Party. There's an anecdote, actually, of him meeting Margaret Thatcher himself as a young Conservative activist that he often brings up, that left a profound effect on him as someone who then wanted to go into politics. Yes, a Thatcherite, although, of course, it must be said that Rishi Sunak is also trying to cast himself as that role, endorsed today by Margaret Thatcher's former Chancellor, longest-serving Chancellor, Nigel Lawson, in the pages of The Telegraph. So Nigel Lawson saying that the Rishi Sunak approach matches more Margaret Thatcher, at least her initial approach to combating inflation. So yes, two visions of Thatcherism here that are being fought out, although if we're to believe the polls, not just from YouGov, but also the Conservative Home website, their members' survey, they're showing that Liz Truss is just so very far ahead, and potentially, just potentially, that might have factored in to Sajid Javid's calculations too.
Double-edged endorsement from Lord Lawson in the sense that he was a fabulous Chancellor by many measures, but eventually let the economy overheat, and that's why he had to go. Emma Webb, how are you reading the Conservative Party contest at the moment?
I find it very interesting that the point that you raised there about the two different versions, two different interpretations of Thatcher's legacy, and just how much emphasis and how much time has been spent arguing which candidate is the real heir to Thatcher. Because I think one of the real concerns in this leadership election is not only who can solve the economy, but who can win the Conservative Party a majority in the next election. And that is very much dependent on those marginal seats in the Red Wall, where Margaret Thatcher is not a particularly popular
Do you think that's still absolutely true? I mean, that's received wisdom, isn't it? You go to depressed former mining towns or shipyard towns and cities, and you say Margaret Thatcher, and you get this reflexive knee-jerk antagonism. What do you think, Tom?
It's interesting. Liz Truss has now, and I've listened to these 3 hustings that have happened so far. I've spent far too much of my life listening to basically the same pitch done in different regions.
As well as watching Star Wars films, Tom.
Far too many. But one of the things that Liz Truss says again and again at these hustings that always goes down very well in the room, always elicits a round of applause, is that these Red Wall constituencies, these constituencies that voted Conservative for the first time, did not vote Conservative because they wanted different people to implement the same policies. They voted Conservative in the eyes of Liz Truss, Freudian slip there, in the eyes of Liz Truss, they voted Conservative because they wanted Conservative policies. And the idea of the Truss campaign is that the government has not hitherto been delivering enough Conservative policies. It hasn't been governing in enough of a Conservative way. And the Liz Truss pitch is that she would do just that.
OK. Tom, thanks very much indeed. Our thanks to Emma, who's going to be with me for the next hour and a half and thereabouts. Let's move on and reflect on what's coming up. Mark White will bring us more on that news that the Independent Office for Police Conduct has launched an investigation into the conduct of police officers. It's an extraordinary story, this. We'd like to know more about it. It follows the death of a one-legged 93-year-old man in a wheelchair who had dementia, who was hit with a baton and stunned with a taser by police and who perished some 3 weeks later. We'll bring you more with Mark White on that story. Back in a moment.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know. The latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News. My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
This afternoon, the Independent Office for Police Conduct has launched an investigation into the conduct of officers following the death of a one-legged 93-year-old man in a wheelchair with dementia who was hit with a baton and stunned with a taser by police, perishing 3 weeks later. Our Home and Security editor, Mark White, joins me in the studio. As I described the story there from the facts that we have, it sounds outlandish and bizarre and sad until we know the actual details of what the police officers faced. And they face everything, don't they? All circumstances the police are called in to deal with. We must reserve judgment.
Yeah, and increasingly, I think from the perspective of the police, they're called to a lot of incidents they weren't called to in the past, but increasingly in today's society, mental health issues, health-related matters that they never got involved in the past, but now they do because of all kinds of health and safety concerns around staff in these care homes and other facilities. They call the police in, the police have to deal with it. Now, as we understand it, this 92-year-old man, Donald Burgess, was a resident in this care home in St Leonards-on-Sea in June this year, when the care staff said that he had a knife and he was threatening staff. They couldn't get the knife off him, and then they called the police. The police turned up. The issue really is about the level of force that was used to get that knife off him. Now, you wouldn't think that someone of 93 years of age would be, particularly robust, given that they were also wheelchair-bound, one-legged man with dementia. We just don't know. But they did spray him with incapacitant spray, the Pava spray. Then he was struck with a baton. Then he was tasered before being handcuffed, taken to hospital, never released from hospital, and 3 weeks later he died. Now, we don't know as yet whether his death is linked to the what he experienced in the care home. There have been post-mortem examinations that have been carried out that have so far been inconclusive. They've ordered more tests that will form part of the Independent Office for Police Conduct in any criminal investigation going forward. The two officers concerned have been put on notice, served with papers saying that they may face manslaughter charges.
Do you know, Mark, setting aside the specific details of this case, which will be tested in court, and we rely on the process to attach proportionality to these things, but what is the protocol on the deployment of tasers? I ask it because, for all it would appear at first blush that this feels like a disproportionate use of force, 93-year-old man, etc., etc. If anybody has got a knife and they're threatening their own life or those of people around them, if they've got a knife, they pose a potential threat. And I would have thought that the protocols governing the use of tasers kick in at that stage.
Yeah, I mean, if this was any other person with a knife and refusing to put down a knife, then they could expect to be tasered. Absolutely. The protocol for the use of taser is that it's there to be used to preserve life, to protect the public. So anybody that is posing a threat that doesn't respond to the officer's calls to put down that weapon or to comply with what they're being requested to do may well be tasered. There are other options open to the police officers as well. Being there in numbers sometimes can be a tactic to rush an individual. Not necessarily if they've got a knife, though. It can be clearly very dangerous. They have this pava spray. It seems that they escalated it in terms of the force they were using against this gentleman. So it was the incapacitant spray to begin with that obviously in the officer's eyes didn't have the desired effect. He was then hit with a baton, again didn't have the desired effect, it would seem, then tasered.
Emma, it may be in the fullness of time we learn that mistakes were made, but just reflect on this if you would, and this is to take a sympathetic view of not necessarily the police officers concerned here, but policing more generally. You set off for your morning shift. You don't know what you're going to get called out to, and the next thing you know, you may be facing manslaughter charges. Who'd be a copper?
I think that there's a real, and it would be very difficult to dispute that there is a crisis going on in policing at the moment, and whether it is because police officers are afraid of the implications of their actions and therefore they may be hesitant to do things that they need to do in the course of their duty, and as a result are not policing effectively, but on the other hand are seen by the public to be acting in ways that the police ought not to be acting. So I'm thinking particularly of the recent arrest of the gentleman who had posted a meme relating to trans ideology and was arrested along with Harry Miller, who people will know from his Court of Appeal victory. And so the police are seen to be policing things on social media, but not necessarily being able to be effective in the course of their duties. So it does make me wonder whether, as you say, why would somebody want to become a police officer in this climate when policing appears to, on the one hand, seem so politicised, but on the other hand, leaves you very open to criticism in terms of how you're able to do your job. Although I have to admit that listening to the details of this case, I find it very difficult to understand why they wouldn't be able to just simply disarm a man from a knife without a taser.
Because we mustn't leap to judgments. That's why. Because often we've covered enough stories, haven't we, Mark, over the years to find out things aren't always as they first seem at first blush. If the press officer for Greater Manchester Police, Chief Constable Stephen Watson, is watching or listening, do get in touch. We would love to talk to Chief Constable Stephen Watson, who's having remarkable results running a hitherto struggling police force in Manchester by saying no to the woke stuff. I'll park that. I'll just go back to the point about tasers. There were, Mark, people who said if you routinely arm police officers with tasers, you will end up with them being discharged unnecessarily. I don't say that about this case. I say it generally.
I think if you routinely arm police with tasers, they're going to be used more often because they are an added option for police to use. But before we go down the road, or those that would like to go down the road of criticising taser, actually, it's a much better option than being shot by a firearms officer, which may be the only option for officers who are dealing with someone with a knife. That would have been an option, and is still an option that is sometimes used if there is not a taser either that's available or the taser doesn't have an effect. Also, being hit with a baton, it could be much more damaging to get a clatter over the head with a baton than being, however painful it is, momentarily incapacitated with the taser stun gun.
I'm all for that, Mark. I totally agree with you. If I was a police officer, I would want to have a taser on my hip. That is for sure, Mark. Thanks very much indeed. Coming up, a rather less relevant question, perhaps, another of life's big questions maybe. Is Britain really as stupid as Love Island suggests. How can the land that gave the world Shakespeare really produce such inarticulate expressions of love and affection? Liz Brewer of Shakespeare's Globe will be joining us. We'll also be speaking to the Director of Energy and Climate Intelligence, who says families across the UK face a hosepipe ban, and that's down to successive governments' failure to address water shortages. First, though, Bethany has the news.
Colin, thank you. Good afternoon. It's 4:34. I'm Bethany Elsey in the GB newsroom. The Bank of England is warning that the UK is facing a long recession and that inflation will peak at more than 13%. Under pressure to control the spiralling figure, the BOE increased the interest rate from 1.25% to 1.75%. That's the largest single rise in nearly 3 decades. The Governor, Andrew Bailey, says there's no ifs or buts in the central bank's commitment to the 2% inflation target.
I recognise the significant impact this will have and how difficult the cost of living challenge will continue to be for many people in the United Kingdom. Inflation hits the least well-off hardest. But if we don't act to prevent inflation becoming persistent, the consequences later will be worse, and that will require larger increases in interest rates.
Ofgem has announced the energy price cap will now be updated every 3 months instead of every 6, warning customers face a very challenging winter ahead. It says the change will go some way to provide what they're calling stability in the energy market, making sure customers are only paying the real cost of their energy. Around 400 migrants in 8 small boats have been brought ashore by border officers at Dover. It comes nearly 2 days after 700 people were intercepted, the largest crossing to be recorded this year. More than 17,000 people have crossed the Channel so far this year, compared to around 9,500 for the same period last year. Archie Battersby's mother says she prays the High Court will do the right thing to give her son a dignified death. Holly Dance says it would be inhumane if they are refused permission to move the 12-year-old from the Royal London Hospital into palliative care. Archie has been in a coma since April. On TV, online and DAB plus radio, this is GB News. We'll get back to Brazier in just a moment.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News. My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Interest rates are going up. They've gone up by half a percentage point. It will have an impact on your mortgage rate if you have a mortgage and if you're not locked in. But if you're a saver, maybe it's better news, so everybody doesn't lose. Emails, Kenny says, now that interest rates are rising and inflation is rising, maybe people will realise how good they have actually had it for so many years. Val says interest rates were much higher in the past, but mortgages were much smaller. The effect of an increase of half a percentage point is much greater on £250,000 than on £50,000. The powers that be made a royal mess of the economy, and as usual, it's the ordinary person who suffers. Keep them coming in. Is Britain really as stupid as Love Island would suggest? How can the land that gave the world Shakespeare really produce such inarticulate expressions of love, affection and beauty? Well, if it helps, and it might not, let's remind ourselves of some of Shakespeare's finest poetry. Where's this going? Love looks not with the... do anybody else want to read? Emma, do you want to have a go at this?
Sure. Love looks not with the eyes but with the mind, and therefore but is winged Cupid painted blind.
Beautifully read. Oh, and that's from A Midsummer's Night Dream. What about Romeo and Juliet?
Did my heart love till now, forswear its sight, for I ne'er saw true beauty till this night.
That's really quite moving in its own little way. Well, now we turn to the declarations of love from the young sweethearts of Love Island 2022. Here are some of them.
We started our journey on separate paths, but our paths ultimately led to one another as I was drawn to you. Your eyes, your smile and your banter, which I absolutely love.
Sometimes you caught me staring at space and asking what's on my mind, but most times it's just me imagining glimpses of the future with you. I'm so excited to get out with you and do everything we've spoken about.
True love is never only roses and flowers. Real things are never perfect.
I know what you're thinking. That last one didn't scan, did it? The pentameter didn't scan. Peter Hitchens in the Daily Mail said, "It's not the sex that puts me off so much as the moronic dialogue, as if centuries of literature, poetry and culture had never happened, and in the richest society in history, we are forgetting how to speak." Will the Love Island contestants' declarations of love stand the test of time? Liz Brewer is a frequent visitor here, etiquette and behavioural expert, but also actually involved with Shakespeare's Globe, which I didn't know, and well done you. Thanks. Fantastic cause. Now, none of us, I think, have sat through a full episode of Love Island, so how dare we criticise the contestants?
I know, difficult to criticise them if one hasn't watched it, but I did watch that clip today, and, you know, what I observe is there they are, especially the winners, they've got a chance to actually express themselves, and it's almost as if they're robots. The thing about Shakespeare's language, it's not that you might not understand it, but if you're there, say at Shakespeare's Globe, watching them on the stage, and they express it, they put their heart and soul into it, and so you get the meaning. It's irrelevant whether you understand the words or not. Here, you've got sort of like two robots, sort of speaking words. It would have been better, perhaps, if they'd read them and then acted upon it and showed some emotion. But that's what was missing. Do
you know what, Liz? Sometimes I think the cult of Shakespeare is overdone. I took my kids to see an open-air Shakespeare play. First Shakespeare I've seen in years, literally years, Othello. Very small cast, half a dozen people. It was brilliant. And I had youngest with me, 12. He said at the end of it, "Dad, that was fantastic." Because it was dealing with big emotions, and the language sort of, some of it went over his head, obviously. He's only little after all. And, but they got it. They got something about it, that there was some magic there.
And there is magic, and heaven help us if they ever take it out of the school curriculum.
Well, it's been decolonised, isn't it? I mean, he's just... Emma,
so
this is where Emma comes in to have a pop at the educational blog.
I feel almost guilty saying this in your presence because I've been very critical of the Globe, at least in the last couple of years, and it's partly because I used to go to the Globe a lot when I was a teenager, and I am, you know, very much a devotee of the cult of Shakespeare. I love Shakespeare. I love the fluidity of his language, the universalism, as you say, these big universal feelings that even if you don't understand the sort of complexities of the language.
Well, hang on a minute. I mean, somebody's got to stand up for the contestants of Love Island here, and it probably falls to me. But there I was talking about, you talking about the big emotional themes, and I'm talking about Othello, and my kids sort of got that. It's about jealousy. We all understand jealousy. They understand jealousy on Love Island, don't they?
Yeah, of course they do.
Whatever happened to love alters not where an alteration finds.
They weren't saying that on Love Island, Emma.
Yes, if you watch that, but we're talking about the speech here.
Well, let's have another listen, just to refresh our minds.
Pity we can't see the last one. Mm.
Oh no, we've only got the pictures, but it's probably no bad thing that we don't hear the words again. Is Peter Hitchens right, Liz, when he says that Love Island is a celebration of a kind of cultural dumbing down, and that the TV channels that used to bring you Kenneth Clark's Civilization now bring you this guff?
I know, and it's interesting, isn't it, to know whether or not the viewers really want it, how many people do watch it. Obviously, it's all geared to advertising, but it's a shame if that's now what we're left watching on, the normal channels on television. It's a shame, and I think it's affecting that age group hugely, apart from the fact you're supposed to look like that, but behave like that. And it's not how you need to behave.
It also suggests, I think, that even though it's still being taught within the curriculum, we obviously have a poverty of language. I haven't seen Love Island myself, but I do hear it on a day-to-day basis, that like I mentioned, the fluidity of Shakespeare's language and the creativity there, that people's vocabularies have become very limited. And it is more than just this dumbing down. It's a kind of flattening of the way that we use language into this one-dimensional world. Limiting
vocabulary. When you think Shakespeare had the use of, 17,000 words, and yet he had a normal upbringing, same as his fellow man, but 17,000 words, and which he used. Nowadays, I wonder what the vocabulary is. I mean,
lest we all want to open a vein, when I see my teenagers watching Love Island, somebody used a phrase in the newsroom earlier. They said sometimes it's done almost as a kind of class voyeurism. That's a crude way of putting it, but I worry, I suppose, that sometimes people are sneering at the poor, sneering at the chavs.
Do you think so? I mean, I'm not sure I agree with you there, because this winner this time, David, mark you, I'd have given him the winner's prize as well. But the way he behaved was charming in his speech. We didn't see that, but his speech was charming and actually had some expression in it. And I don't think it was to do with that awful word, class.
I fear that there's a conflation there between people who we believe sound dumb and people who we assume are working class, because I don't think many of the contestants, at least as far as I'm aware, are actually from working class backgrounds.
Is that right?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Happy to be corrected if
I have
wrong.
no idea.
Do you know how many emails we're going to get off the back of this? Martin, thanks so much for coming in. Really appreciate it. Continue your great work at the Globe. Thank you. We are moving on to something very different now. South East Water has announced a week-long hosepipe ban for 2.2 million customers in Kent and Sussex, and it starts tomorrow. England has suffered its driest 8-month-long period from November to July since 1976, 8% of average rainfall last month alone. Look at that cricket pitch. Well, you can't if you're listening on the radio, but it looks a mess, apart from the square, which is green, and everything else around it yellowy brown. Also warnings from Thames, South West and Wales Water that they may need to introduce restrictions if dry conditions persist. And having just looked at the weather forecast for next week, they will, in England at least. The Director of the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit and former BBC Environment Correspondent is Richard Black, who joins us now. Hi to you, Richard. Golly, this is a drought.
I'm sorry, I missed you there, Colin.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is one heck of a drought.
It is, and these things seem to be getting more common as well. As you were saying earlier, exceptionally dry conditions. The driest start to a year, the driest July in England since 1935, the driest July in parts of the south since a century before that. So yes, this is quite some drought, but of course it's not a unique event. We had the last big one just in 2018, just 4 years ago.
Before we get on to why we're here, just in terms of ameliorating the ill effects, we know how hard it is to build new reservoirs, don't we? We know actually, I mean, for all people say get leaks fixed, they don't much like it when they pull up behind the roadworks on their high street. So quick fixes are in short supply.
They are, that's absolutely right. And the other thing about fixing leaks, of course, is that in the end, the customers will pay for this because the companies, will have to fund the work. And of course, that will come through on people's bills as well. I think the key thing really is what level of risks is the country prepared to run, and what does the government do in order to keep that risk at a reasonable level? Because, as you were saying, every new reservoir, and actually there's only one reservoir being built in the UK now, the first one for 30 years, everything costs money. So the more you spend, the less we will, suffer from droughts which will occur in the future, but all that goes on bills.
There's a population dimension to this, I would suggest, which is if you increase your population by 10 million in 20 years like we've done, there's more water being used.
Yes, and especially in the area of the country as well, in the south. And I think a lot of this does come back to the distribution of people and the distribution of rainfall and the distribution of water. So basically, if you look at the climate change projections for the UK, basically you can sum it up as the further south you are, the drier the summers are likely to get, the more sort of dry spells we'll have in the south in the summer, and the more rainfall and more intense rainfall we'll have further north. So it's a question of the time of year, and it's a question of where those impacts are felt.
Richard, before we let you go, it's an allied story, and you're absolutely within your rights to say I don't have a strong view on it or any view on it. But in the next hour, we're posing that question whether you ought to be willing to snitch on the neighbour for using hosepipes, etc. For some people, that's denunciation and ought to have no place in a civilised society. For other people, it's an act of good citizenship. But where do you stand, if anywhere?
I think the one I wouldn't give an opinion on it, Colin. The one thing I would say is that there are exceptions to the hosepipe ban. There are exceptions where people are allowed to use hosepipes. So I check if I were tempted to do such a thing, I would check first of all whether my neighbour was in one of those exempt categories. I think.
If I were tempted to use that, it's terrific. Richard, thanks very much indeed. Richard Black there. Let's see what Emma Webb makes of that. Emma, what do you make of it?
Well, I mean, it just adds to what so many people have been saying about climate catastrophe and so on. And I think that a lot of this is feeding into people's hysteria over that. And I fear that this is going to, as we saw with the fires over the heat wave and so on, that this is being used by people to push a particular political agenda. But on the other side, there is a very serious point to be made here, which is that, as you have already alluded to, that we haven't invested in the proper infrastructure to make sure that we can provide enough water for the amount of people who are in the country presently, but also just looking at the numbers of people coming into the country, having 700 people cross the channel illegally in just one day alone. This is a significant pressure that is putting on our water supply, and we should have had the foresight, especially given how much people talk about climate change and the world heating up, that this is something that we should have been planning for, whether you believe that climate change is occurring due to man-made causes or not.
OK, Emma, thanks very much indeed. More emails, and they're still very much focused on the leadership election. Dan says the failure of Labour to support Red Wall voters has resulted in a definite shift in how Thatcher and the Conservative Party are thought of. I think Liz Truss would make a great PM, says Dan. Paul says Sajid Javid, the Jedi Knight, he's more like Rishi's Darth Vader, now given his choice as the next PM. Sajid Javid says Derek is nothing more than a career politician doing anything he needs to climb the greasy pole. He is no better than Sunak or Johnson. First time this week, we've had the chance to get to 5 to 5, discussing 5 things that you might want to know about before 5 o'clock. At 5, Britain's oldest twins have celebrated their 103rd birthday. This is Thelma Barrett and Elma Harris. They said a bedtime tipple was a secret of old age. The twins now live in different counties. They were reunited yesterday for a party with their families. At 4, Warner Brothers' Batgirl, the movie, scrapped for poor reviews, apparently. The studio already spent 80 million pounds on the film. It was filmed in Glasgow, by the way, but its release was believed would hurt the brand. Those who viewed the film reportedly said the costumes were subpar. The story was a huge disappointment. At 3, Stoke-on-Trent. Stoke-on-Trent is Airbnb's top UK destination when it comes to staying in a unique property. The online rental platform put the Potteries City at the top of the list for places to stay, with different buildings like windmills, converted barns or tree houses. It's placed ahead of traditional holiday locations like Scarborough, Paignton and the Isle of Lewis. At 2, the Archbishop of Canterbury is at it again. He's urged fossil fuel companies to ensure the poorest in society are not being deprived of energy. Speaking at a conference of Anglican bishops, Justin Welby said companies should work to change the world, as he condemned the record profits of energy firms using non-renewable fuels. And at 1, pig organs have been partially revived an hour after one of the animals was killed, in a study which has challenged some assumptions about what happens in the moments between life and death. Researchers from Yale University were able to undo some of the damage done to animals which had been dead for an hour. 5 things you might want to know or not want to know about before 5 o'clock. Emma Webb, what caught your ear?
Well, I'm particularly interested in the last 2 stories there. Firstly, the Archbishop of Canterbury's comments about fossil fuels and protecting the poor. I think we have to bear in mind that Justin Welby actually was an oil executive before he was Archbishop of Canterbury.
Puts him in a better place to talk about it.
It marks yet another traipsing of the Church of England into politics, and they seem to be more concerned to actually behave like a political party, which is how this statement came across. It sounded like the words of a political party, saying that they really wanted to try and bully the oil companies into doing what they want. And I think that many people will be very unhappy about that. And also I thought that the final story there was very interesting, particularly because of what it suggests about, as you said, the moments between life and death and what happens in that hour, that it might be possible, particularly for people who need organ donations, that this could increase the number of organs that are available for people who need them, but also that it suggests that perhaps death isn't exactly as final as and definitive in that moment when the heart stops as perhaps we thought that it was.
And you don't have a strong view, at least, on Stoke being the most popular Airbnb destination in Britain?
I did think, reading the article, that maybe I might visit Stoke. I mean, obviously they're very famous for their pottery, and so it could be an interesting place to visit. But Airbnb, apparently, people are paying money to go and stay in tents, in trees, and all sorts of unusual locations, including something that was described as an earth dome.
An earth dome?
An earth dome. So if you wanted to go camping in an unusual location, it seems that Stoke might be the place for it if you want to stay in a barn.
If you can explain, perhaps with a diagram or picture, what an earth dome is, we'd love to know. Email us, please. And also, if you're keen to invite Emma to the sites of the potteries, do email us about that as well. Sam says by email, the Love Island crowd think pentameter is a new mobile phone. What has happened to society? Louis says sometimes it's not about how you say it, it's about letting out how you feel. We shouldn't judge people for how they express themselves. We're talking about Love Island, by the way. Peter Hitchens, the columnist, says it's a mark of how we've declined as a civilization. Strong words, and we were discussing them a short while ago. And Steph simply emails very succinctly. Steph says, I despair at Love Island. What do you think about Love Island? What do you think about interest rates? What do you think about any of the stories we're covering today? We'd like to know. Email us with to the usual GB News address at GBViews, and we'll try and share some with our viewers and listeners. Stay with us.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Hi there and welcome to Brazier. Coming up live at 5 this afternoon, the Bank of England has warned we face a year-long recession starting this autumn. Before that bombshell, it produced its own headline, interest rates up 0.5%. Stand by for costlier mortgages. A huge blow for the Tory leadership candidate Rishi Sunak as Sajid Javid pledges his support to Liz Truss in the race for number 10. We look ahead to tonight's TV debate between the pair. Also, the Attorney General, Suella Braverman, has branded the diversity industry a new religion. She's calling for a crackdown on diversity training. Amen to that. It's something Stephen Edgington from The Telegraph has been campaigning for. He joins us at 5:30. And with me for the next hour, the political commentator Emma Webb. But first, the latest news headlines with Bethany.
Colin, thank you. Good evening. It's 1 minute past 5. I am Bethany Elsey in the GB newsroom. The UK economy is facing its longest recession since the financial crisis, with the Bank of England warning inflation's likely to hit 13%. The forecast came as the BOE announced its biggest interest rate rise in nearly 30 years, hiking it by 0.5 percentage point to 1.75%. Mortgages and loans will be more expensive, but there'll be a better return on savings. The Governor, Andrew Bailey, says the central bank is committed to its 2% inflation target.
I recognise the significant impact this will have and how difficult the cost of living challenge will continue to be for many people in the United Kingdom. Inflation hits the least well-off hardest. But if we don't act to prevent inflation becoming persistent, the consequences later will be worse, and that will require larger increases in interest rates.
Well, the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, is blaming the government for losing control of the economy.
I think the people who are asleep at the wheel is the Conservative government, because the UK is forecast next year to have the lowest growth in the G20, except for Russia, and the highest inflation in the G7. 12 years of Conservative economic mismanagement have led us to be uniquely exposed to the higher gas and electricity prices.
Ofgem has announced the energy price cap will now be updated every 3 months instead of every 6, warning customers face a very challenging winter ahead. It says the change will go some way to provide stability in the market, making sure customers are only paying the real cost of their energy. Ofgem boss Jonathan Brearley cites Russia's actions in Ukraine as being behind the volatile market, leading to a surge in gas and electric prices. Archie Battersby's mother says she prays the High Court will do the right thing to give her son a dignified death. The court is currently holding a hearing into the parents' request to move the 12-year-old to a hospice. In a statement, Holly Dance said it would be inhumane if they are refused permission to move Archie from Royal London Hospital into palliative care. Archie has been in a coma since April. Around 400 migrants in 8 small boats have been brought ashore by border officers at Dover. It's only been 2 days since the largest crossing was recorded this year, which saw nearly 700 arrivals. This brings the number of people who've crossed the channel in small boats this year to almost 17,300, nearly doubling the number of migrant arrivals from a year ago. In the latest Conservative leadership hustings, Rishi Sunak attacked Liz Truss's economic policies again. The Foreign Secretary reiterated her promise to cut tax and grow the economy without driving prices higher. However, the former Chancellor warned against cutting taxes before inflation is brought under control. Ms Truss is also coming under renewed pressure to make good on a promise she reportedly made to a group of war widows to restore their pension payments. A change in the law in 2015 means war widows who remarry no longer lose their £7,000 a year payment. But around 300 service widows who married before 2015 have not had their pensions restored. One of the widows, Margaret Allen, is calling on Ms Truss to fulfil her commitment.
I would ask her to stand by that statement and resolve this now. It's almost 7 years we have been campaigning to get this corrected. All we're asking for is parity with our peers. We've struggled, we've been traumatised and stressed for 7 years. Enough is enough.
In Russia, a judge has sentenced basketball player Brittany Griner to more than 9 years in prison for drug smuggling and possession. It comes 6 months after the American was arrested in an airport with a vape cartridges containing cannabis oil. US President Joe Biden described the jail term as unacceptable and called on Moscow to release her immediately. And the amount of coral growth at Australia's Great Barrier Reef has reached record levels. Researchers say it's the most coral cover they've seen in 36 years. But experts are warning it's still vulnerable. Mass bleaching and climate change could quickly unravel the progress. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens now. Let's get back to Colin.
Let me just start with some news that's just dropped, and it concerns the grooming scandals in particular afflicting parts of the north of England, this one in South Manchester. Now, the Independent Office for Police Conduct, it's been looking at who ordered an investigation getting on for nearly 20 years ago. It's called Operation Augusta, to be dropped. Who ordered it to be dropped, and why did they take the decision to drop the investigation? This investigation prompted by the intervention of the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham. He's been wanting answers to this. Operation Augusta, it was named after a young girl who died of a heroin overdose, and it identified at least 57 victims, 97 potential suspects. The reason it was called Operation Augusta was in connection with the girl who died, who had been raped and injected with heroin by a 50-year-old man. She died of a drugs overdose in 2003. The Independent Office for Police Conduct cannot fathom why that police investigation into grooming by predominantly men of Pakistani heritage in South Manchester was dropped by the police. We'll try and talk to somebody about that story in the course of this hour. Main news this hour, though. The Bank of England has raised interest rates to 1.75%, the highest level since January 2009. The largest rise this in interest rates since 1995 comes as inflation is expected to peak at 13.3% in October, the highest level since September 1980. Andrew Bailey, the Governor of the Bank of England, also said that the UK will enter a year-long recession.
Now, this rise in energy prices has exacerbated the fall in real incomes and so led to another significant deterioration in the outlook for activity in the UK and in the rest of Europe. GDP growth in the UK has slowed and the economy is now forecast to enter recession later this year.
Well, let's turn to the principal economist at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, Dr. Kamal White. Dr. White, thanks for your time. This is a gloomy set of predictions from the Bank of England.
Yes, indeed, it is gloomy. We have actually produced our forecast at the National Institute recently, and a couple of days ago, actually. And the forecast today by the Bank of England is even more gloomy than we had forecasted. But we can't say we didn't see this coming, because we've had inflationary pressures as a result of what's happening in Ukraine. So one would like to think that the bank had to be this hawkish in its approach today.
When it comes to inflation, do you think we're sometimes guilty, it's not just this story, many stories, of being a little bit parochial, ignoring what's happening out there in the rest of the world? We know that inflation is a global problem. I'm looking, for instance, at some figures from the OECD. They calculate our inflation measure in a different way. They say it's about 8.2. By the standards of developed nations, that's below the average. America, 9.1, Spain, 10.2, Sweden, Austria, Portugal, 8.7, Netherlands, 8.6. If you switch on a lot of coverage of inflation in Britain or read the newspapers, you think we're an international inflationary pariah. It's not true.
Well, that is true. That is true. And it all depends on, like you said, how we go about measuring and capturing these inflationary figures. There are many ways to measure it. So it all depends on, as you said, how you go about. The ONS will have a different approach to the equivalent statistical institute, for example, in France. So it all depends on how you go about measuring your CPI, for example.
Is raising interest rates the only club in the Bank of England's locker when it comes to tackling inflation?
It isn't, but it is what the bank deems the most appropriate at this time. Of course, we have quantitative tightening that the bank can and should and will do as the governor has announced. But at this time, the bank feels the most appropriate way to tackle this surge in inflation is to move with interest rate hikes. But this isn't a phenomenon that we're only seeing in the United Kingdom. This is something that we're seeing globally. We've seen massive rate hikes across the globe since we have sort of emerged from the pandemic. So this isn't a situation that is unique to the United Kingdom, of course. So this isn't a surprise. What I've seen today. Many might have argued that the bank should have been raising rates even sooner than they did and should have been more aggressive in their rate hikes before now.
Doctor, can we invite you to join the prediction game and tell us where you think interest rates will stop and when they might start coming, when inflation will start coming down?
Well, our own forecast at the National Institute sees interest rates reaching around 3% by Q2, Q3 of next year. And we see inflation coming back below target just in 2024, so around the first quarter of 2024. And I think this is even a bit more optimistic than the bank has suggested. So, yeah, my own view, for what it's worth, is that I don't see inflation coming below the bank's 2% target before 2024.
Wow, that feels a long way off, doesn't it? That is the principal economist at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, Dr. Kemal White. Doctor, thanks for your time. Appreciate it. Emma Webb's alongside me. That's gloomy.
Isn't it? And I wonder how much this actually has to do. You pointed out that it's happening all across the world. This is not in the same way that we've seen with previous economic crises. It's something that is domestic, that this is something that is going on everywhere. How much this has to do with the lockdowns and with the economic destruction that so many countries wrought on themselves during the pandemic, because we knew at the time that that was something that was going to cost us. We know that was going to result in economic damage. Some people compared it to economic vandalism. And so I wonder, we talk a lot about what is going on in Ukraine, and we talk about all of these other things happening internationally, but I haven't heard very much said by economists on the impact of lockdowns on what we're seeing at the moment.
There was a feeling, wasn't there, as lockdown was lifted, that all this pent-up pressure from consumers was being unleashed, and actually that stoked up a lot of demand for commodities. So I think it was talked about. I think it's probably been forgotten about now to some degree, hasn't it, Emma? Thanks very much indeed. We're going to get into the politics, not the economics? Yeah, economics. Now, Rishi Sunak has attacked Liz Truss's plans for the economy ahead of the pair facing one another in a live TV debate tonight. The former Chancellor, who's up against Liz Truss in the battle for number 10, said her plans to cut tax would further drive up interest rates, crikey, raising mortgage payments too. At a hustings event in Cardiff, that was last night, Liz Truss tried to convince Tory members she was the right leader to win an election.
I think as somebody who is from not a Conservative background, who, I've got friends in other parties, my family, lots of them don't support the Conservatives. But I know how to convince people and how to bring people on board. So I think being a convert is actually an asset, because what do we have to do at the election? We have to convert people. We can't just talk to ourselves. We actually have to go there and win in the country.
Joining me now, David Maddox, political editor at The Express Online. David, welcome to you. How's she doing, Liz Truss?
Hi, Colin. I think she's really picking up steam, actually. You wouldn't have believed it 2 or 3 weeks ago, but the beginning of her campaign was so flat and lacking in life and energy. In fact, we all thought she may be forced out at various stages with the MPs, but she really seems to have found her kind of zing, if you like, in the leadership debates. The tax issue really seems to have kind of really driven her campaign forward as well, and that was a very powerful line there you just clipped out on the importance of being a convert and persuading people. That will have a lot of resonance with Conservatives.
It will, won't it? I agree with you. I mean, this idea that you shouldn't be apologetic, you should be looking to actually persuade people by the power and compulsion of your arguments. Just on Rishi Sunak, I've got to spare a thought for Rishi Sunak. Just on Rishi Sunak, he's described Sajid Javid as his Jedi master, his sort of political guru. There's no love lost in politics, is there really? Sajid Javid's now come out for Liz Truss.
Yes, that was a bit of a surprise yesterday evening. I have to say, I was only slightly less surprised by that than I was when I found out that Penny Mordaunt was backing Liz Truss as well, given that the two had been taking chunks out of each other in the previous weeks. But it shows you that friendship doesn't go very far in politics, actually, and the prospect of backing the winner and maybe getting a job goes a lot further in that case, because the polls of members seem to suggest that this is miles ahead in this contest.
Yeah. Miles ahead. Has she overpromised? I say that because there was a story in the Times today. They've been crunching the numbers, as we must say. 80 billion, they reckon the bill is. 80 billion, her spending promises, whether that's things like increasing defence budget to 3% or cutting back on various planned tax rises. Where's it coming from?
Well, that's going to be a very good question. And I think Rishi's argument that she's going to end up borrowing a lot and putting it on future generations is actually a fair one. Unfortunately for Rishi, is that all this is falling quite flat because, he is a man over the last few years who has steered the economy. He's the guy who's now, like it or not, I hear what you were saying about the Western world essentially having the same problems, but he's the guy who's the villain of the piece. He's having the blame pinned upon him because it was his economic stewardship, printing of money, giving out free cash, all the rest of it, which Emma was talking about during lockdown, that has really kind of driven this inflation. And it's very hard for him now to say that I am the Conservative one, I've got the careful plan, when he's been splurging the money over the last couple of years.
Yeah. Splurging is one word. David Maddox is political editor at The Express Online. David, thanks for your time. Emma Webb's here to reflect on how it's going.
I think David made a really interesting point there, because the way that this is being framed generally is that Rishi is presenting himself as being the fiscally responsible candidate, whereas Liz Truss is spend, spend, spend. But on the other hand, Liz Truss is far more low tax than Rishi Sunak is. And I think that there's a point to be made about the irresponsibility that many Conservatives see in Rishi in the way that he has behaved, in terms of quantitative easing and so on, and the way that he behaved during the pandemic. It's true that many people will pin the blame on Rishi and see his economic philosophy as having played into the circumstances that we're in now. I'm not economically savvy enough to know exactly, how responsible he is. And as I mentioned, this is something that is happening internationally. But certainly he has been at the helm of our country's finances, and therefore surely the buck in some ways must stop with him. And so I think actually this way of sort of making a dichotomy between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak and presenting Rishi as this responsible candidate is something that amongst the Conservative Party membership, particularly because of Liz Truss's success in the polls at the moment, may be in question.
Amongst those Tory party members, do you think they just want a conviction politician? And more than that, do they want to roll the dice a little bit? I mean, they must know, we all know, this is a high wire act, isn't it? Cutting taxes on the scale that's proposed. Tory party members, I suggest to you, Emma, are thinking, might not work, might really blow up, but what's to lose?
I think that Conservative Party members, and I base this on the popularity of Kemi Badenoch, even though she was knocked out of the race, that was on the basis of the decisions by politicians, not by Conservative Party members, that what Conservative Party members are looking for, and I think the country more broadly, particularly in those marginal seats where people may have voted for the Conservatives but may not be members, they want somebody who has real Conservative principles, has a backbone, has a vision, and is willing to pursue that and make sacrifices for that goal. Someone who actually believes in something, because I think people are sick of what they view as career politicians, people who are out to change whichever way the wind is blowing in order to climb the political ladder. They want somebody that they can believe in, and most importantly, and this is something that was epitomised by Kemi Badenoch, and I think people see more in Liz Truss than in Rishi, is they want somebody that they believe they can trust.
Emma Falau, thanks very much indeed. Coming up, we're going to be talking to former Superintendent at the Met Police, Kevin Hurley. What does he think about a 93-year-old one-legged dementia sufferer being tasered by officers? That's to come.
Hello, I'm Alex Deacon with your latest weather update from the Met Office. Sunny spells for most tomorrow. Showers across the north, whereas the south will stay dry. That's the forecast for a number of days ahead, thanks to high pressure slowly but surely moving in. Low pressure is close to northern Scotland, and that will throw some showers in here overnight. We've got some around at the moment. And I think as we go through the evening, we'll see a few more showers coming into the north of Northern Ireland and the west coast of Scotland. Later in the night, maybe one or two coming into northwest England and North Wales. Bit of cloud at times across East Anglia in the southeast. Small chance of a shower here, but really not much in the way of rainfall at all. And a cool night, certainly compared to earlier in the week. Much fresher, much less humid. Some places starting off in single figures on Friday. We'll start off with quite a bit of sunshine over Wales, the Midlands, southern England and eastern England, eastern Scotland too. Further west, there will be some scattered showers, and we'll see those showers developing more widely over northern England and central and eastern Scotland come the afternoon. But easing in western Scotland, the south stays dry, quite warm here, but as I said, it won't be as humid. On the cool side further north, we might get up to 20 Celsius, but generally mid to high teens. Still a few showers in the east during tomorrow evening, but they'll fade pretty quickly. So for most, it's going to be a fine Friday evening. Quite cool, though. Temperature will drop off fairly sharply, and it will be a bit chilly first thing on Saturday morning. But again, it's blue skies, certainly for the majority across England and Wales. Northern England will cloud over. A fair bit of cloud at times for Northern Ireland. Certainly a grey start to the weekend in Scotland. But even here, generally turning brighter through the day. We'll always keep some outbreaks of rain going across the far north, where it will again be cool, but elsewhere signs of temperatures on the rise once more. Similar conditions on Sunday, with some patchy rain across the far north and northwest, but for most it's dry with sunny spells. I say signs of things warming up into next week. We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
25 minutes past 5, you're watching Brazier on GB News. Now, tackling the bad behaviour of police officers in Britain must be the top priority for the new head of the Metropolitan Police. So says the Home Secretary, no less, Priti Patel, who met with the incoming Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, there he is, earlier this week, a meeting at which she claimed there was a pressing need to restore trust in the cops. Sir Mark is due to take charge of the Met at the start of next month and pledged to be ruthless in removing police officers, as he put it, corrupting the integrity of forces. Let's turn to the former Detective Chief Superintendent at the Met Police, Kevin Hurley. Kevin, welcome to you. Can I start, you're the former police officer, I'm not, but can I start by offering some advice to the incoming Metropolitan Chief Constable to look at what's happening in Manchester under Chief Constable Stephen Watson, who's taken over a struggling police force there. He's gone back to basics. He's done some really obvious things, like insisting that police officers shave when necessary, maybe even think about polishing their boots, and it seems to be making a difference.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, as you know, I'm one of the 6 applicants for the Commissioner who lost out to Mark Rowley, so I wish him well. But I have to say, my plan was on day one, call in the first police station on the way to work, get them all out and inspect how they looked, check their pocketbooks, because if you don't start with basic standards and a basic sense of pride in whatever organisation you work for, whether it's the Metropolitan
Police force, Kevin, it's you know, you just look at some of the, plenty of pride in the police force. Just look at some of the police cars sprayed in the logo.
Yeah, I mean, bottom line is, any organisation, if you don't have a pride in who you work for, then what else is going to follow? And following on with that point, of course, all this nonsensical showing a particular political view, really, painting police cars in these different colours, is quite wrong, because of course the police should be apolitical. But my view, in terms of what the Home Secretary says, what we need to do with policing generally is start, yes, exactly as the Chief Constable in Greater Manchester is doing, and incidentally he did extremely well when he was Deputy Chief Constable in Durham, doing stuff what works. But what they now need to do as well is look at how are we going to lift police morale and police sense of pride off the bottom? Because the bottom line on it is, when officers are leaving in the numbers that they are, particularly experienced ones, we are ending up with very young junior officers policing. We often used to call them goldfish. The reason why I say goldfish is if you look at goldfish in a goldfish bowl, they go around going, Policing is a lot about experience and learning. And when you're new on the job, you're suddenly juggling with a real fast-moving situation in front of you, as well as legislation that you know could be heard many years later in this High Court, never mind all the complaints you've got against you. So they're in a really difficult position, though morale, training, professional standards, and frankly paying them better. Because of every group of public sector workers in the country, the police have suffered the greatest loss in purchasing power. I love the job when I joined, but I wouldn't join it now because the pay and conditions is so poor.
Wow. What if, just setting aside the pay and conditions, maybe not conditions, but setting aside the pay, what if our police forces, too many of them, are locked in this sort of downward spiral, this doom loop, where, as you say, when we had those austerity years 10 years ago, police numbers were dramatically cut back, and then Boris Johnson comes along and says we'll have 20,000 extra police officers, but actually what you've lost is that trickle-down of expertise and experience that comes from those experienced officers. Is it possible that that's actually irrecoverable and we will not get a police service anything like as competent as it once was?
I think it's going to take at least 10 years to start to restore that. And the reason I'll use it is just on a basic police shift in a city. You had people on those shifts with maybe 18, 20 years experience. The average level of experience of the senior people on shifts now is 3 years. And from my knowledge of policing, I can tell you a 3-year-old, not 3-year-old's wrong, but the 3 years service police officer, relatively speaking, knows very little about the wider aspects of policing or indeed what they do. To me, the real problem with policing is the public know exactly what the police should do and what they want them to do, but it's just that the police chiefs and the politicians who give them all their silly targets don't know. They should ask the public. It's obvious. Turn up for people who've had their cars broken into, burglaries of their houses, sort the yobs out on the street, stop play acting on TikTok and virtue signalling with 101 different things, and also support the police. Understand, yes, we want proportionate use of force, but don't scare the cops literally to death in getting stuck in anymore because they think they're going to be investigated or suspended. Most people out there understand when you're arresting a violent person, quite often you actually have to punch them or kick them or smash them to the floor. That's what happens.
Yeah.
People have got to understand that and remind that instead of listening to all these bleeding heart people saying, oh, too much force, too much force. It's very difficult to control someone who doesn't want to be arrested.
Kevin, just on that point, and I know we don't want to get dragged, and you certainly don't want to be dragged into the specifics of a case that's broken in the last couple of hours, or details of which have just broken in the last couple of hours, concerning a 93-year-old man with dementia, one-legged, in a care home. He gets pepper sprayed, he gets tasered, he dies 3 weeks later. Subject of an ongoing inquiry. Let's park that. But just on the point you're saying there about the use of force by police officers, the proportionate use of force, where, very broadly, so give us some context on tasers. Are we using them too much, too little? Where do you stand?
They're not using them enough. And the reason I say that is, obviously the first thing you want to do is try and diffuse the confrontation by being sensible, emotionally intelligent, and trying to persuade, cajole in the appropriate circumstances. If you can't do that and you then have to go to what we might call a hands-on situation, the least injurious way of applying force to another person is to give them a low amperage electric shock with a taser, as opposed to what I've just described, punch them, kick them, force them to the floor, or hit them repeatedly with a metal button, or spray their face, eyes and nose with a very unpleasant irritant spray. People need to understand that a taser is not some kind of a space-age weapon. It gives you a 5-second electric shock and it's all over. You stand up, you don't feel anything else, except by then they've got the handcuffs on. If you're trying to deal with someone who doesn't want to be arrested, even a woman actually with 2 or 3 or 4 men, it's a terrible scene. You're going to have to force her to the floor. Handcuffs go on. Well, you can all remember the image of the gingerhead self-promotionist who got herself arrested at the Sarah Everard vigil. You know, if she'd have been tasered, whoosh, tasered, handcuffs on, instead falls to the floor, handcuffs, and then handcuffs applied. The bottom line is, if I'm being arrested and I'm going to fight a policeman, I would far prefer they taser me than hit me repeatedly with a metal button, knock me to the floor, squash me or whatever. People need to understand tasers are much safer than anything else police can do, apart from a negotiation, of course.
Kevin Hurley, always giving us a perspective from experience of what it's like to be a police officer, and we appreciate you for that. Thanks very much indeed, Kevin Hurley.
And good luck to Mark Rowley. Good luck to Mark Rowley.
Amen to that. Coming up, would you snitch on your neighbour for using a hosepipe? South East Water's announced it's introducing a hosepipe ban in Kent and Sussex, with Southern Water doing the same in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. Would you snitch on somebody using their hosepipe next door? That's next. First, the latest news headlines with Bethany.
Colin, thank you. Good evening. It's 5:33. I am Bethany Elsey in the GB newsroom. The UK economy is facing its longest recession since the financial crisis, with the Bank of England warning inflation's likely to hit 13% this year. The forecast came as the BOE announced its biggest increase rate hike in nearly 30 years, raising it by half a percentage point to 1.75%. The Governor, Andrew Bailey, says the central bank is committed to its 2% inflation target.
I recognise the significant impact this will have and how difficult the cost of living challenge will continue to be for many people in the United Kingdom. Inflation hits the least well-off hardest. But if we don't act to prevent inflation becoming persistent, the consequences later will be worse, and that will require larger increases in interest rates.
Ofgem has announced the energy price cap will now be updated every 3 months instead of every 6, warning customers face a very challenging winter ahead. It says the change will go some way to provide what they're calling stability in the energy market, making sure customers are only paying the real cost of their energy. 2 Sussex police officers are facing possible manslaughter charges after a 93-year-old man with dementia was tasered at a care home. The pensioner, who was in a wheelchair and had one leg, was threatening staff with a knife when police responded, hitting him with a baton and using something similar to pepper spray. He died 3 weeks later. The Independent Office for Police Conduct is investigating the incident at St Leonards-on-Sea. On TV, online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. We'll get back to Brazier in just a moment.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
But first, here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy you $1.214 and €1.188. And the price of gold currently stands at £1,473.30 per ounce.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News, investments that matter.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Big story today, interest rates up 0.5 percentage point and inflation not looking too good either. I ought to say, actually, we're just seeing that the FTSE closed up today. Funny how economics works, isn't it, on the back of those interest rate rises. You've been emailing in about it. Ruth says interest rates were indeed higher years ago. However, houses were cheaper. It's also very important to remember that salaries were much lower. Tony says it's about time most people stop complaining and blaming the government and the Bank of England. It will be tough, but we need to work together to get through these times. Neil says the interest rate should never have been on the floor in the first place. The policy mistakes go back decades. The underlying mistake is the central planners' belief that they can and should prevent recessions. We now have the effects of 3 recessions rolled into one. Our debate this hour. A hosepipe ban in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight is poised to come into force tomorrow following the prolonged dry weather. Southern Water threatening, I think that's probably the right word, anyone who breaks the ban with a fine of up to £1,000. They're also urging people to snitch on neighbours if they are found to be breaking the rules. So our question, would you denounce your neighbour if you saw them violating a hosepipe ban? It cuts to the heart of questions about neighbourliness and social cohesion and how much we trust the people who live around us. We're joined by Mike Parry, the journalist and radio presenter, and Emma Webb here in the studio, who's, I think, going to take a contrary view. Mike, to you, what do you make of this?
Well, I think that if I saw my neighbour using a hosepipe and there was a ban in place, and I do own a property down in Hampshire, by the way, so it could happen to me quite soon, I would without doubt, first move would be to approach the neighbour and say, this is totally antisocial, you should not be doing this, and switch it off immediately. And if the neighbour then got a bit shirty with me and said, you mind your own business, I would then pick up the phone and report them to the relevant authority. It's the most selfish act you can possibly indulge yourself in at the moment when we're desperately short of water. What I'd say is, Colin, is this. My view is that water that the neighbour is using belongs to me as well as to my neighbour, because water comes from rain. Rain falls out the sky. Nobody owns water. Nobody owns rain. The way that we distribute water in this country, with water companies making massive profits and also massive mistakes in distributing water, is an utter scandal. I'd have the water system renationalised at a stroke, because I think that's the only way you can fairly distribute water without charging people huge amounts of money. But to answer your first question, any neighbour of mine who brings out a hosepipe when the ban is on, I will report them to the authorities without a flicker of conscience.
Emma Webb, Mike Parry would shop his neighbours, but he'd have a word with them first, and that's important, isn't it? That's the neighbourly thing to do. Before you denounce them, have a quiet word.
Absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't say before you denounce them. I'm no snitch, and I don't think people should be snitching on their neighbours to any relevant authorities. I don't actually think there should be a relevant authority in relation to hosepipe bans. I think that's quite an absurd suggestion. But I think having a nice, polite word with your neighbour, if you think they're doing something wrong or if you think they're doing something selfish, sure.
But what if they carry on, Emma, as Mike Parry suggests? What if they carry on? What do you do then?
I think it's just something that you have to accept. I don't think that you should be doing anything silly like reporting them to the police. We saw this during the lockdowns. We saw this during COVID, people ratting out on their neighbours. You know, we often talk about things like social cohesion, neighbourliness. I don't think that it's very neighbourly necessarily to be doing something that is particularly selfish, but it's also not very neighbourly to rat them out to any authorities at all. So I think particularly with something as small town as this is just like curtain twitching, nosy Parker, a snitch behaviour, and I just don't think it's acceptable. Sorry.
No, You see, Emma, what I would say there is I would say that people who are bullies in life, people who are arrogant, people who think that they rule the world, will take advantage of nice-natured people like yourself if you say, I wouldn't go so far as to pick up the phone and report them. Now, during the heat wave, I had a neighbour, and who was the American president, Colin, who said, never mind the man who can stand up to his enemies, give me the man who can stand up to his friends, right? So I've got a neighbour just across the way from me. I live in a penthouse. We have roof gardens, and his is the garden. And I told him to put out a barbecue that he lit on the day of the hottest day in the year here. He wouldn't put it out, so I called the fire brigade. Now, we're not that neighbourly now because I called the fire brigade, they came round. When I got onto 999 and spoke to the controller lady, I explained exactly the circumstances and she said, you are very right to call us. We're sending a unit. You're being very responsible. Thank you very much. So I think, Emma, although you want to be nice to your neighbours, you also have an obligation to society as a bigger unit to do the thing that is right for our society, and that is to stop people wasting water in a drought.
Emma, you're too nice.
No, I think that, yes, I agree. You should have the guts to stand up to your friends whenever that's necessary. I'm certainly not advocating and never have advocated that people should be wimps. But I think this is also about character. If you're going to talk about having a duty to your society at large, I think you have a duty to cultivate a good character. And I don't think you reporting your neighbour to the fire brigade because he wouldn't put out a barbecue is you know, cultivating a good character. I think you have to think about the sort of person that you are. And actually, I don't think that it's very neighbourly, to, as I said, to rat out on your neighbours. Sure, have a nice, robust word with them and try to have good relationships with your neighbours so that they will want to listen to you if you want to raise any issues with them at any point. But this is about being a good neighbour, and I think that this is a not fighting fire with fire sort of situation.
Well, what about all the houses that burnt down during the heat wave? They literally did burn down. 2 of them at least are thought to have started from barbecues. And I'm talking about a barbecue in a roof garden on the top of a penthouse. And I literally stood on a barrel, went over the wall and said, look, you shouldn't be doing this, mate. This is outrageous. You've got wooden trestles all over the place. You've got furniture. Please put it out. He wouldn't. So I had no option but to call the authorities. And when they got here, they said to me, you did the right thing, that was responsible. So you've got to make the big decision sometimes, even if you're going to become unpopular with people around you.
It's an interesting talking point. Mike Parry, Emma Webb, thanks both very much indeed. Mike, who was that president that you mentioned?
Well, I don't think it was Lincoln. I think it might have been Harry Truman, but I'm not sure.
OK, we'll get on Wikipedia, try and find out. Mike Parry, thanks very much indeed. Emma Webb too, thanks a lot. Now, the Attorney General, Suella Braverman, has hit out against the diversity industry, branding it a new religion where zealots seek to punish unbelievers. A whiff of the Old Testament about that language. She also revealed she scrapped diversity training in her own department, government department, after learning that staff had spent almost 2,000 hours on the courses last year. Stephen Edgington is the video content comment editor at The Telegraph. Stephen, I made a hash of that. Anyway, I'm glad you're here. It's an important story, this, and it really... we were talking about it yesterday with Toby Young from the Free Speech Union, the extent to which the mission creep of human resources departments has grown and grown and grown. They now consider their purview not just to be what happens in the workplace, but what happens outside of the workplace, within and without, but also they want to police you the way you think, it seems to a lot of people.
Some of the way these civil servants talk is absolutely fascinating. I mean, you're right about HR departments, by the way. This permeates throughout private industry.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing, obviously, about this is that public money is going towards these woke training courses. And it's not just the training courses, but there's lots of other events within the civil service that are voluntary that will help you progress in your career up the ladder if you sign up to be, for example, what's called an inclusion champion. So I did a story with The Telegraph at the weekend where we revealed that 6 permanent secretaries at some of the biggest departments are diversity and inclusion champions for various different causes. So they're like sort of woke superheroes. That's how I like to call them.
It's like being the Cubs, isn't it, and getting your badges on your arm.
Well,
Inaya Falarin Imam, in your newspaper today, Inaya of this parish, wrote about what she described the diversity industrial complex, which I thought was quite a nice way of putting this. And what it hints at is the producer interest. There are people making shed loads of money out of this guff.
Absolutely, follow the money. And, you know, millions of pounds. We know that millions of pounds of taxpayer money is being spent on the diversity courses. And one thing to mention is, why has this happened under the Tory government of the last 12 years? Because these courses didn't exist under Tony Blair, and obviously they followed cultural trends that have happened in recent years. But why has the government let this happen in the first place? Why has it taken them until now to start to look into this stuff? And when they talk about banning these woke courses, Jacob Rees-Mogg said recently that he was going to ban these diversity and inclusion courses. How are they going to do that? I want to know some of the details. I want to know exactly what they're going to be doing.
Stephen, what I want to know as an employee that I can stand up straight. So when I was at my last workplace at Sky, I was invited, note the word, invited, to participate in a, wait for it, mandatory unconscious bias course. I mean, an invitation suggests you can say no, but it's mandatory, suggests you can't say no. So that's a bind that you find yourself in as an employee. Went on the course, it was guff. I got to the end of the course, any questions? I thought, well, I really want to say, how much are you charging for this garbage? But I thought, well, I've got a family to support. I better keep stum. And that's what happens, isn't it?
I've spoken to so many civil servants who have been put in a difficult position like you have. And I think in particular with this Suella Braverman story, so she's obviously the Attorney General and she runs the government legal department, which is basically thousands of lawyers who work for the government across different departments. And I've been speaking to some of those lawyers. These are serious people, been training in law for 40 years, some of them, and they've been forced into these mandatory courses, one of them called Inclusion in Action. And in this course, we revealed that civil servants were told to imagine a gay Japanese grandfather to help combat their hidden prejudices in this way. And again,
do you know many?
I don't know many myself, but I can certainly imagine it, and hopefully it will make me more diverse and inclusive somehow. But the difficult position that these people were being put in, and you know, some people were getting quite emotional about it. Like, what am I meant to do here? I've got to feed my kids. You know, I can't. And sometimes they don't have a choice. So it's important that for real inclusion, they don't have to.
I had a choice, by the way, which is why I left Sky. Emma.
Well, I think that this is an issue that goes, I mean, we know from the work of the Free Speech Union that this is something that permeates through all parts of society, and people are repeatedly put in difficult positions, not only within the civil service, but, you know, it's everyone across the spectrum of any job that you could imagine, including train drivers, teachers. And so it's something that I think affects more people's lives than necessarily the public are always aware of, because the coverage can only ever be the tip of the iceberg, and it's created this hostile, toxic atmosphere across the country. And so I think the description of it as being like the witch trials is very appropriate. So anything that Suella Braverman says along these lines is hugely welcome, because it marks a sea change in the way that we are willing to deal with these things. But as Stephen mentioned, what we need to see is for these things to actually be implemented and pushed out of various institutions and workplaces, because they are, as Suella Braverman said, not just damaging, but actually can be dangerous.
Emma, thanks very much indeed. And Stephen, thanks to you and the Telegraph for doing so much on this. It's worthwhile. Thanks a lot. Now, hundreds of British war widows are calling on whoever becomes the next Prime Minister to right an historic wrong and reinstate their war widow pensions. Until 2015, those whose partners died in active service were stripped of their pensions if they remarried. Although the law was changed 7 years ago, around 300 who had married before were not included in the new scheme. Our Home and Security editor, Mark White, spoke exclusively to some of the widows who say they've been forgotten by a government that does not care.
He lived for flying. You marry somebody in the Air Force, you marry the military, and everything that comes with it.
Jude Howcroft's husband Bill was killed in a flying accident behind the controls of his RAF Tornado in 1998. In the months before his death, Jude recalls one particular conversation where her husband insisted if the worst ever happened, she had to try her best to move on with her life.
Bill actually sat me down and said, right, we need to have a conversation. Things do happen, you've seen it. And I want you to promise me that if you fall in love again, you don't hold back and you live your life for me and the kids.
7 years after Bill's death, Jude finally found love again and remarried. Official government policy meant she automatically lost her £7,000 annual war widows compensation payment.
I have never stopped loving Bill. Ever. But the fact that I had to give up my pension, it was almost being judged that how dare I find love again. I clearly couldn't have loved my first husband. And it just makes me so angry.
In 2015, the government changed its policy, ensuring any war widow who remarried still received their war widow's pension. But hundreds who'd remarried before that date were not included. They are, they say, the forgotten widows.
What's wrong? It's immoral. It's discrimination. And the compensation, which is called the war widow's pension, is the only tangible link these individuals have to their late husband.
40 years after the death of her husband Ian aboard HMS Argonaut in the Falklands, and although Margaret Allen remarried, she is still profoundly affected by his loss. She met the then Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Liz Truss, in 2018, who promised to right a wrong, to ensure that war widows' pensions were restored. Margaret's now calling on the woman who may well be our next Prime Minister to make good on that promise.
I would ask her to stand by that statement and resolve this now. It's almost 7 years we have been campaigning to get this corrected. All we're asking for is parity with our peers. We've struggled, we've been traumatised and stressed for 7 years. Enough is enough.
We are the forgotten few. Our husbands paid the price, but that injustice remains. We're not asking for anything that isn't rightfully ours.
That report from Mark White. Up next, it's Dubes & Co. Here's Michelle.
Hello, Colin. Yes, coming up tonight, I'll be joined by Lawrence Fox and Pimana Assad, and some of the topics that we'll be getting into are the escalations in the China-Taiwan situation. Should Britain be worried about what's going on there? Should we even be getting involved ourselves, yes or no? Also, nanny states. Are we in one? The government is pushing more water companies to have things like hosepipe bans. We're seeing councils now calling for bans on sales of barbecues. And we're all being encouraged to snitch on our neighbours. Is it nanny state gone mad? And lastly, quickly, Colin, mandatory discrimination training. Should it be banned?
Yes. Michelle, thanks very much indeed. Last word to Emma Webb, who's been my guest today. 10 seconds, you go.
Well, for me, I actually think that the biggest story of the day, and people keep talking about it, seems to be this: whether you should snitch on your neighbour's business.
And you are not a snitcher.
And I am no snitch, and nor should anyone else be.
OK. Michelle's next. Stand by.
Hello, I'm Alex Deakin with your latest weather update. Tomorrow will be similar to today. Many places seeing sunny spells, much of the south remaining dry. There will be some showers across the north. There's a big area of high pressure that's slowly moving towards the country. That's going to bring most of us a fine weekend. Further north, there is a little low pressure that is bringing some showers and will continue to do so during tomorrow. The showers scattered across the northeast chiefly this evening, but we'll see, I think, a few more coming in across Northern Ireland, western parts of Scotland overnight, maybe one or two getting to northwest England and North Wales. A bit more cloud at times across East Anglia and the southeast, but generally here it's going to stay dry, and it will be quite a cool night, certainly compared to earlier in the week. Some towns and cities dipping down to single figures. So a fresh start to Friday, a sunny start across much of the Midlands, South Wales, southern and eastern England and eastern Scotland. A scattering of showers elsewhere, and what will happen through the day, I think the showers will start to move further east, so we will see some developing over northeast England and eastern Scotland, whereas western Scotland generally turning drier, and Northern Ireland too. Sunny spells lifting the temperature in the south into the low, maybe mid-20s. Generally further north, actually a little cool for the time of year. Certainly feeling cool when the showers come along. And there'll be a few of those through the evening, but they disappear fairly sharply. And so most will have a fine Friday evening. But then we are looking at more cloud and rain coming into the northwest on Saturday, making for a grey start across much of Scotland, a bit of rain here and there, staying fairly damp across the far north, but otherwise, again, most places dry, and certainly across most of England and Wales. Lengthy spells of sunshine likely on Saturday, and after a cool start, temperatures will be on the way up through the weekend, back into the mid-20s across the south, still high teens further north. Some more patchy rain across the far north on Sunday, but many places dry this weekend. Signs of things warming up into next week.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything